This is Kiana Park from SpyPalm Partners. I'm facilitating the TAM webinar series. Welcome to webinar 10 in our 12-part Transportation Asset Management webinar series sponsored by Federal Highways and AASHTO. The topic of today's webinar is approaches to integrating risk into TAM programs and plans. Webinars are generally held every 2 months. However, the next webinar, Managing Off-System Assets, will be held August 13th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I wanted to point this out that this is a shorter break between webinars than usual because we had to reschedule this one due to a conflict with a very similar webinar on the same day last month. So stay tuned for our next webinar coming up in just 1 month. And for more information on this webinar, visit tam.transportation.org and click webinars. And when you click that, you will be able to see the slides from this webinar as well as kind of a audio video of this webinar where the slides with the voice will be on a file that you can replay. You'll also find archives from previous webinars, and again, you'll get today's webinars in a day or two. If you have any suggestions on future webinar topics or have questions for the presenters today during today's webinar, please submit your comments or questions to the webinar Q&A feature that you'll see on your screen in the webinar tool that you're using. So we will have a Q&A feature at the end of this at the end of the presentation, and so what we're going to do is we'll just take them in the order that you submit your questions, and then I will direct it to the presenter who best can answer the questions. So, and with that, I will turn it over to Steve Gay from Federal Highways, Office of Asset Management. Steve.
I hope you can all hear me.
Yes, we can.
FHWA is pleased to present this webinar in cooperation with AASHTO, Subcommittee on Asset Management. We're going to focus on a topic, risk. I know there's been other past webinars on this subject. And we're still getting a lot of questions how to best address it. Under MAP 21, state DOTs will soon be required to develop and implement risk-based asset management plans. And we're doing what we can to support agency in this process. We've had a pilot project working with New York, Louisiana, and Minnesota to develop a risk-based asset management plans. New York will be speaking today, and you can even access their draft asset management plan from the FHWA Asset Management website. We also have published a 5-part series on risk in asset management, and you can access those also from the Federal Highway Asset Management website. And related to this, I know Federal Highways Office of Planning has a pilot state project working with extreme weather events and climate change that in some cases they also are specifically dealing with this issue. Also, we're working with state DOTs to help them understand how risk management can be used to improve decision making. And I think today's presentations will help states understand better. And later on you can ask questions. If you're finding you have some issues to deal with, don't hesitate to ask the presenters. I think a key is, as we move ahead, is looking at the risks. Certainly look at extreme weather events, seismic issues, or even dealing with issues of funding as it comes to preservation. That the asset management plan, MAP 21 requirements include managing for the whole life. And that would include issues such as doing preservation at certain times. What happens if you don't? That certainly places an increased financial burden in the long term on the state DOT. And how do you tell that story? I think a key is illustrating how risk management can improve programs, and we're hoping to discuss how risk management prepares for and responds to disasters, etc. You can find more information on this on the Federal Highway Asset Management website, including past webinars that have been recorded. Passing it back to you, Jana.
Thank you, Steve. Today's presentation includes 4 perspectives on risk in relation to transportation asset management programs and plans. We will hear about the experiences of state DOTs already engaged in taking on these challenges. We'll also hear from 2 presenters who've been supporting state DOTs in these efforts. Presentations will highlight both successful approaches and some important lessons learned. Following an overview presentation to set the context, each presenter will focus on specific aspects of risk and asset management. As mentioned previously, the purpose of the webinar series is to share lessons learned, ideas, and knowledge with the asset management community. For this webinar, the primary learning objectives are building working knowledge of key concepts and definitions relevant to risk and risk management, understanding specific applications of risk and risk management to TAM programs and plans, and beginning to apply this knowledge in order to answer how can risk and risk management help improve the management of infrastructure assets? What benefits can states expect by applying risk management to their TAM programs? What are the key lessons learned for agencies just beginning to manage risk as part of their TAM program? The key is to share lessons learned, ideas, and knowledge. For the agenda today, we started off by hearing from Steve Gay. I will introduce our speakers before each presentation, but in brief, for our first presentation, we'll hear from Gordon Proctor of Gordon Proctor and Associates. Our second presentation is from Kevin Walsh of Massachusetts DOT on climate change and extreme weather events. For our third presentation, we'll hear from New York State DOT, from Brad Allen addressing his agency's risk register and their asset management plan. And for our final presentation, Mark Wesley from Shannon and Wilson will speak on integrating risk into a TAMP. We'll have a Q&A at the end, and just another reminder, please submit any comments or questions using the webinar Q&A feature. Our first presentation is from Gordon Proctor. Gordon serves a number of transportation agency clients in the area of asset management, performance management, and strategic planning. He formed Gordon Proctor and Associates in 2007 after 15 years at the Ohio Department of Transportation, including 8 as ODOT's director. Among his many accomplishments, Gordon recently co-authored the 5-part series of reports on applying risk management to asset management for federal highways that Steve discussed in our introduction. Gordon will be drawing on many of the definitions, lessons, and conclusions from these reports in setting the context for us today. Now I'll turn it over to Gordon.
All right, thank you, Jana, and good afternoon to everyone, and good morning. Appreciate everybody being here. Yeah, I will try to set the context. We've got 3 great presenters following me, and I'm going to try to set them up with a little bit of context about risk and risk management and the various ways it can be applied. And I want to start off by emphasizing that risk is more than dealing with threats. Dealing with risk management is the dealing with uncertainty, variability, opportunities in addition to threats. And a way to think about this is, would you want to put your retirement portfolio in a risk-free investment? And you may not, because you're not going to earn much in the way of return or reward for doing that. So we're always managing risk, and what we're trying to do is manage it intelligently and balancing it. So the risk that we'll be talking about in terms of asset management includes some threats, certainly, but it also includes the uncertainties and the variabilities and the opportunities that you will be dealing with. If I could have the next slide. be talking about enterprise risk management, and by that we mean managing risk across the entire organization or the entire enterprise. And within that, we'll later talk about some categories of risk. But really, risk management really boils down to a few basic questions, which are, what are we really trying to accomplish? What are our asset management objectives or our safety objectives or our project delivery objectives? What are our greatest objectives that we are tasked with? And then what threats or uncertainties or variability could stand in the way of achieving those objectives? How will we deal with those? How will we invest very limited dollars to mitigate the greatest threats? Most every agency will be dealing with limited budgets. And so how would we use a risk-based process to make those allocations of our limited resources? And then finally, what sort of reasonable risk are we willing to take? If I could have the next slide. Risk management really serves as a nice complement to asset management and performance management. And the members of the international SCAN team who went abroad and looked at risk management a couple of years ago came back and came up with this graphic that I think works very well. If you think of asset management and performance management as your drivers towards your strategic objectives, those are the things that push the organization forward to achieve your biggest objectives. What risk management is sort of like a navigation system or a suspension system that helps cushion the threats and the variability that you're going to be facing as you try to achieve your strategic objectives. So it really doesn't, risk management does not replace asset management, it doesn't replace performance management, rather it's a complementary system, complementary process that allows you to achieve more readily the objectives that you may have for both asset and performance management. Next slide, please. Many of the organizations that are dealing with risk right now deal with it in at least 3 different levels. One would be sort of enterprise or strategic risk. These would be risks that affect the entire organization, such as a lack of funding or lack of political support for transportation. If you were a program manager in charge of bridges or pavements or safety or maintenance, you would be a program manager and you'd probably be dealing with program risk. And those would be risks that might affect the collection of projects that make up your program. Or you could be a project manager or an activity manager, such as someone who collects pavement condition data, and you may be managing risks to those. So you'll see throughout the presentations here risk at various levels, and that then leads to how you assign the treatment and the long-term management of those risks later. Next slide, please. I'm going to use a simple example that you may have as you develop your asset management plan. So say you're an agency and you've developed this objective of one of your many objectives in your asset management plan. Say that today in 2014, 30% of the vehicle miles traveled in your state are on good pavements, and you've got an objective to raise that to 40% of the VMT in your state traveling on good pavements by the year 2024. So that's your objective, nice, linear, straightforward objective. The next slide, please. So as you all know, what could possibly go wrong with something that's straightforward? Well, as you know, lots of things could go wrong. Your long-term funding is very uncertain. You don't know what your costs are going to be in terms of long-term inflation rates. You may or may not have great confidence in your pavement models. If you're a state such as Ohio that has fracking, or a state such as Idaho with timbering, those kind of industries can really have a lot of pavement impacts on certain parts of your network. You may have internal operational issues such as lack of project delivery or poor maintenance or even poor materials and construction. And you may also be dealing, obviously, over 10 years with increased climate change threats. So as you look forward in terms of trying to achieve this very logical long-term goal, you're going to be facing a lot of variability and uncertainty, and therefore each of those are a risk. If I can have the next slide. And the types of risk and the categories of risk in that little simple example would include financial risk, information risk, asset risk, if some of those pavements are already very poor performing and don't last very long, don't perform as well as you want. You may have individual pavements or classes of pavements that could be risks. You may have operational risks such as your internal processes. A subset of that operational risk may be decision risk if you're not confident that all the people who are making project selection and maintenance decisions are necessarily making the best long-term decisions. Those could be risks. And of course, the external risk of climate change and things and events that you may not be able to control. The next slide, please. And in a risk-based asset management plan, as you'll see later from our other presenters, they will take various steps once they've identified these risks to either treat them, to tolerate them, to try to terminate them, to transfer them to a third party, which we don't often are able to do, or to take advantage of it. Is this really an opportunity? So as a risk that you'd be identifying in your asset management plans, you'd probably be making one of these 5 decisions. Do we treat it? Do we tolerate it? Do we terminate it? Is there something we can do about it? Next slide, please. And so then, as you think back to the little example here of our pavement goal, as you develop your types of treatment in your asset management plan, for some of your risk, you may not have very many good treatments, such as financial risk. You may not be able to control what Congress does long time and over the long term. And you may just be demonstrating and communicating and articulating that uncertainty. Hopefully, you'll have an opportunity to seek more revenue, but you may or may not be able to have that as a risk treatment. If you've got information risk, you may well be taking steps to try to fill those internal gaps and improve your management systems. And as you can see, you may be taking a variety of different steps along the way in your asset management plan and your risk plan to identify what types of treatment and what kinds of steps you're going to do to try to address these long-term risks to your asset management objectives. Next slide, please. This chart is sort of a universal chart that you would find in risk management plans and guides from around the world. It's very much, as you can see, a process improvement type of framework in which in the traditional asset or risk management process, you would start by establishing what you're trying to accomplish. That would be establishing your context. You'd be identifying your risk. You'd be analyzing what are the root causes of those risks. You would be evaluating the probability and the impact of each of those risks, and then you would be identifying treatments for those risks. And as you can see by all the arrows going back and forth and up and down, that it's intended to be a very dynamic process involving a lot of internal and external stakeholders of communicating, identifying risk, treating risk, and explaining which risk may impede the objectives that you're trying to achieve. So risk management is intended to be a very active, very continuous, ongoing process, and is supposed to be operating in parallel with and complementary to your asset and performance management systems. Next slide, please. And I really like to emphasize that in the risk management literature, it really is about balancing risks and rewards. It's not just battening down the hatches against every possible threat. It's about trying to take intelligent risks so you can achieve acceptable levels of reward. And so it's really a lot about consciously weighing the opportunities that you have, prioritizing where you can, and deciding where it makes sense to take a reasonable risk in exchange for achieving a reasonable reward. At the same time, it is about identifying those external threats and even internal threats that you have to deal with that may well impact your long-term asset management objectives. Next slide, please. So in a few simple steps, if you're an agency today and you're not quite sure what risk-based asset management is and you would like to get started in it, what very simple things should you do? Well, you probably would want to form a risk team or a team within your TAM team, your asset management team, to begin developing your risk register and your risk program. The ISO 31000 standard, that's the International Organization for Standards, they've developed a skeletal but comprehensive ISO standard for risk management. And that little graphic we showed a couple slides before came right from ISO. And if you were to spend the $75 and get the ISO standard, what it would tell you to do is to begin by identifying what your asset management goals and objectives are and what your real critical assets and priorities are. Then you would walk through a comprehensive process of brainstorming and working with your own staff to identify what are those risks, how can we rank them, prioritize them. Then we would decide how we're going to treat or tolerate if we can. We would actively try to manage each one, just as you would try to manage any other objective within your organization. You would be communicating your risk treatments both within the organization and externally, and hopefully you'll be trying to continuously improve and update your risk management practices. So this would be a process that would work in parallel with your asset management and performance management programs, trying to make sure that you've identified the things on the horizon that could impede you and making sure you're taking reasonable steps to try to address them. The next slide, please. As Steve mentioned, there are some resources that you can work with right now. I'd really recommend the ISO 31000 Risk Management Standard. It's not a highly detailed, but it is a very comprehensive standard, and it really gives you the outlines of a good risk management approach. The International Scan Program of Federal Highway 2 years ago did an excellent report on international best practices on risk management. That's on the International Scan website. That's the sort of maroon or red document there. It really gives you a sense of how other agencies are handling risk management. And then there's the 5-part series that Steve mentioned. Hopefully by this fall, there's intended to be an NCHRP risk management guide coming out, and that guide hopefully will give you a step-by-step series of steps to take to implement a risk-based asset management and enterprise risk management program. So the next and final slide here. If you ask yourself, well, why would we be wanting to do risk management? And there's a lot of reasons. One is that in this day and age, it's a basic corporate competency. You couldn't go to a bank or an airline or insurance company or a good hospital and not find an active risk management program. For our industry, risk management can also really help tell our story. You're going to be trying to achieve some long-term pavement, bridge, and asset condition targets for the long term. But as you know, there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of variability, and the risk management plan and program can allow you to document that and incorporate it into your asset management program. It's a really good complement to your asset management and performance management program, and as you'll see in our later presentations, risk management can really help you document the very, very painful trade-offs that you're having to make with your existing resources. You will be prioritizing them probably based upon their highest risk, investing to address those highest risks, and illustrating the difficult asset trade-offs that you're having to make in our currently constrained fiscal environment. So with that, I hope that provides some context for what risk-based asset management might look like and some examples. And with our later presenters, you're going to see a lot more very detailed, very practical examples. And with that, Yana, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Gordon. That was a wonderful context builder for the remaining presentations. Our next presentation from Kevin Walsh of Massachusetts DOT addresses the risks associated with climate change and extreme weather events related to asset management. Kevin is the Director of Environmental Services at Massachusetts DOT Highway Division. In response to the 2008 Massachusetts Global Warming Solutions Act, he helped draft NYSDOT Highway Division's Climate Change Adaptation Plan. The plan outlines the Highway Division's short-term and long-term strategies to adapt its roadway network and infrastructure to climate change. As a member of the steering committee for AASHTO's Standing Committee on Environment and chair of the SCOE Environmental Process Subcommittee, Kevin has worked extensively on climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. He was recently appointed to MassDOT Highway Division Asset Management Steering Committee as the environmental representative. Kevin has served as the Director of Environmental Services since 2007 and has more than 25 years of experience in environmental compliance for MassDOT. Now I'll turn it over to Kevin.
Thank you, Yana. So in Massachusetts, we're a coastal state. We have identified climate change and extreme weather event as one of those risks that we need to consider as we are developing our TAM. And it's directly related. When I started getting involved in climate change, it was in 2008 with the Global Warming Solutions Act. And all state agencies at that time were directed to develop goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also developing strategies to adapt to potential effects of climate change. And we formed a multidisciplinary team that developed those strategies. And as we were talking about them, we really realized that a lot of things we were talking about were about risk. There wasn't enough data. There was a lot of uncertainty to some of the predictions, and we needed to gather more information. So we developed some strategies. We implemented those in the end of 2009 and have been moving forward on those. But I'm going to talk today about 3 specific projects that we developed as we went through that process since that time. They are listed on the slide. You see the complexity of each project goes up as you go down the list. So there's less complexity to the inventory of flood-prone areas. It's something that you can do in-house that any state agency could do, and at very little cost. And then as they go down, they're more complex. All right. So I just saw there's geospatial data collaboration, and I'll see if I can talk about that. So next slide, please. In March of 2010, this is really when we started our inventory. We had back-to-back 25 to 50-year storms. We had over 30 highway locations that were completely flooded over that 3-week period of storms, and 100 local roads that were out of service and completely blocked off. During that time, we had extensive public outreach, and we had multiple blogs and web access and announcements. So we realized that's a lot of data that's out there that we should gather and start looking towards those inland areas. We had really good information on potential sea level rise effects, but the only thing we really knew about the inland areas was that we're going to get a little bit more rain, and it's going to be in more intense extreme events. So we felt like this was a good chance to look at, if it's flooding today, let's inventory it. It's likely it's going to flood tomorrow. So we started that process, and we did a series of surveys. And if you could go to the next slide, we created the Inventory of Flood-Prone Transportation Assets. It took a number of surveys, and what we finally realized is we needed to go out and talk to people. Everybody was too busy to really respond to these surveys in detail. And actually the surveys, what we found was where the latest storms were, that's where we were getting the best results. So if the storm was in Eastern Mass, we were getting really good input from there. But this is something that you can, as a state agency, can easily put together. When we were in the middle of that inventory, please do the next slide, we found Tropical Storm Irene, which found us in Western Mass. It very severely affected other states, especially Vermont. They had Hurricane Irene and Lee, but we were affected, and our Route 2, a major east-west roadway, was completely taken out over a 20-mile area for a 4-month period while we had to rebuild it in many areas. So we were in the middle of these surveys. We decided to go out again and talk to our folks and go in person, and we expanded our mapping to over 300 locations where there are regular past history of flooding. And if you go to the next slide, just another shot of some of the damage from landslides. And you can go right to the next slide. This is the map that we created, and what's interesting about this map is, well, a couple of things. One is by color coding, you can tell the number of times a structure or roadway floods in any given year. But you can actually zoom in on this, the GIS layer, and when we went out to each district, we went over every single one of these points. And we had all the maintenance folks in there and construction and operations, and they knew every single location. They knew how severe the flooding was, how frequent it was, how long it lasted, and in most cases, why it was flooding. So it became a very good resource for us, and we now use that as we're screening projects with the approach that let's not miss any opportunities to make our system more resilient and minimize risk in the future. So let's make sure that if we are building a project that we're addressing the issue to the extent that we can. Next slide, please. So the next project was the Deerfield River Watershed Vulnerability Pilot. We're about to start this. We've negotiated a contract. We're going to develop a fluvial geomorphology model, which is essentially a model that will show the effects of a stream within the embankments and the length of the watershed. So you're not just looking at one particular location, you're looking at multiple locations. And what this slide shows is the watershed, the Route 2 area that was we lost in the storm, and the yellow dots represent roadways, crossings, and bridges across streams. So there's over 800 locations that were going to be included in this model. And could you go to the next slide? Using that model, we'll be able to assess all those roadway and stream crossing locations, including climate change, into those predictions, and then assess them with this design support tool. So that you'll be able to tell, if we do increase the size of this culvert, what effect will it have downstream and upstream? Is this a good investment? Is this something that we should be doing? That's what we're hoping to have that done in 2 years, and we're about to start that project. And the final project that I'm going to touch base on today is our most sophisticated project. If you could go to the next slide, which is the MassDOT Federal Highway Pilot Project. We were in the second round of pilot projects that Federal Highway funded. We're looking at climate change and extreme weather vulnerability to the Central Artery project. We spent a lot of money building the Central Artery. It's a critical resource to the city of Boston, and we want to make sure that it is not vulnerable to extreme weather. So I've listed a few people here, including myself, but I want to point out Steve Miller is the project manager. He works in my section, and he's working with Catherine MacArthur as the assistant project manager. And our team is made up of University of Massachusetts, including Ellen Douglas at UMass Boston, Paul Kirshen at University of New Hampshire, and Kirk Bosma from Woods Hole Group, and he's the one doing all of the sophisticated modeling that we're working on. Next slide, please. So I like to show this picture because I like it better than a locus map, because it shows you the area that used to be the Central Artery. The Central Artery is now underground, but this area right in the center of the area where there's some green space and roadways down there, that's parkland. There used to be a big green, rusty, elevated structure there, a viaduct that went through the city. It was in gridlock a good part of the day. That's now gone. The I-93 has been moved below ground, which, as you can see here, also means it's below sea level. The Central Artery is a critical link to the area, both the regional transportation network and to the city of Boston. It's an important economic engine, and it's a major emergency response route. By lowering this into the ground below sea level, it has revitalized the waterfront of Boston. It's been a huge economic boom, and it's an important resource. Next slide, please. So our project objectives were to assess the vulnerability of sea level rise and extreme storm events to the Central Artery, and look at ways that we can reduce those risks of the vulnerabilities and establish an emergency response plan for the tunnel, which might include, for instance, as you go into as a hurricane approaches, you might need to close down the tunnel a day in advance, as an example. Next slide, please. We have a outside stakeholder committee made up of transportation agencies, our sister state agencies in the environment, FEMA, the federal and Massachusetts emergency management agencies, and the Boston Harbor Association. Because in this case, we were building upon a study that the Boston Harbor Association already had completed. And then it's important with these studies to have a technical advisory committee so that you can validate the information and test your theories and make sure that it passes with the experts in the field so that you can depend on the results of the model. Next slide, please. Just for those of you who aren't familiar with Boston, that's a zoom in of the city of Boston where we're focused. Next slide, please. And this is where it all started. The Boston Harbor Association created this map. This is what we call a bathtub map. It's essentially taking sea level rise, existing sea level rise, and layering 1 foot elevations on top of it. This represents about a 5 foot increase. This could happen today with a spring high tide and a 2.5 foot storm surge coming in. It represents some substantial flooding, and it's similar actually to what we experienced in Hurricane Sandy. Next slide, please. This slide represents the shocker. This is what could happen if we had a direct hit from Hurricane Sandy. And keep in mind, this is from a bathtub effect, just a bathtub analysis. This is the slide that I showed our highway administrator when he asked me the next day after Hurricane Sandy, what if it had hit 6 hours earlier, 6 hours later, or been as strong as when it landed in New York and New Jersey. I said, I've got these two slides. It's somewhere in between. We have a vulnerability pilot application in right now with Federal Highway to develop a model to look at this further. And that's where we are today. Next slide, please. So I'm just showing this to show you that these are all the roadways that are underground that we're looking at. There's 3 tunnels underneath the Boston Harbor and the tunnels underneath the city of Boston. Next slide. So why do we need this sophisticated approach with this sophisticated model we're proceeding with? The risk is high, and it's an important resource, critical to the region. The Boston Harbor Association inundation maps were not really sophisticated. They were a great starting point and a great first approach, but they didn't include a lot of the effects of flooding, so you're not necessarily seeing the full extent or an accurate representation of all the areas that might face flooding. So we're going to build upon what they did and add the flooding pathways that will come out of this model. We're looking at wave effect, and we'll have a better understanding of the cause of flooding, and then most importantly, be able to test engineering adaptations and look at those based on the risk and the probability and see how far we want to go with any adaptation measures. Next slide, please. So this is the model that we use. It's called ADCIRC model. Federal Highway used this on the Gulf Coast 2 study. We're building upon it here. As I mentioned, it includes waves, wave setup, river discharge. We have 3 rivers coming into the Boston Harbor. That's an important factor in considering any storm surge coming in. If those are at peak flow while we're at peak flood level while a storm comes in, the impacts would be much more severe. And it covers a large physical area because you have to look at a hurricane. It's a massive storm system. So it's the Gulf of Maine that we're looking at in the model. Next slide, please. There's a lot of data that's required. And what we've discovered with a lot of the vulnerability pilots for climate change, it takes a lot longer than you think it should when you start the project. There's a lot of data. And the data is not necessarily as complete as you would think. The central artery is a new project. We have CAD drawings of that central artery, but they don't necessarily translate well into a single format for the purpose of this. We had LIDAR survey for the city of Boston, but there's a lot of interference in urban areas with LIDAR, so you still have to do a lot of ground truthing. And the other part on this slide for the data, what we're lucky about in this area is we do have good historical high tide marks and a lot of good information from the blizzard of '78 for flood levels, and we're using that to validate the model. Next slide. One more. So we're going to run a series of simulation scenarios using the Monte Carlo approach. Essentially, you're rolling the dice. You're throwing multiple 1,000 different potential paths of hurricanes and intensities and running them through. And that gives you, once you get through that, you get some probability, so you can start looking at the chance and the potential impact to your resources. We're going to run it for present and future climate change scenarios, looking out at 2030, 2070, and 2100. And we're going for not just tropical storms, the hurricanes, but this is the first time ever we're modeling nor'easters. So that's the work that UMass and Woods Hole Group are working on. But because of that, it's a very intense level of data. We're running the Monte Carlo approach at the UMass Boston supercomputers. Next slide, please. So in that model, we'll develop a grid system. Each one of these nodes represents a water elevation. As you get closer into your area, the grid becomes more unstructured, and you can pinpoint specific areas that you want to focus in on. It becomes a more dense grid as you get closer and more high resolution. Next slide, please. So that represents the grid. What you're seeing there, the city of Boston with the grid overlaid it. If you look in the central artery area, it's a more, much closer tight grid. That's where we're focusing on. Next slide. So this next slide, we get some fun aspect of this model, being able to show you, if it works here, a quick simulation of, this is a validation run. Ran through it pretty quickly. What the type of data you get out of here, you start to see flood elevations on a time lapse. And what we got out of this, we ran this only for validation. It's not a final model, but it shows you the paths of flooding that might occur. And so what we're doing now is going out to areas that it looks like there are some anomalies, and we're doing additional survey because we realized that the LiDAR survey might not have picked up something, or something strange is happening, and refining that data as we go forward. So next slide. So there's some challenges as we develop these models. A sophisticated model and the urban model grid development, it's a lot of data points, and there's no quick and easy way to get it. LiDAR is a good place to start, but you still need to do a lot of ground truthing. Running both hurricanes and nor'easters, it's a big data. It requires a lot of computer power to run. There's a significant tidal influence in New England compared to other areas. It's about a 9-foot tidal influence. We have 3 rivers coming into this area, which makes it interesting. And I already mentioned the simulation time. One thing I want to mention, the data, again, digital versus institutional knowledge. When it came to it, if you look at this slide, when we went and talked to the guys that work in our tunnels, that run the HVAC, that run the plumbing, and make sure the tunnels are running every day, all our maintenance and operations people, they pointed out a number of areas that weren't picked up on LiDAR. Well, what about the ventilation shaft that is at street level on Atlantic Ave, and this grade is in a sidewalk. So if Atlantic Ave gets flooded, that's a possible area. So we got a lot of great information from the people that are working in the field that know the system inside and out. Next slide, please. And here's another example on the right-hand side, the picture. This is a vent building. Going down to the tunnels, you'll notice that the ventilation goes all the way down to the ground. So the vulnerability of this, if this is within the flood area, there's a doorway and then there's ventilation. We'll have to develop some kind of adaptation measure to put into place if flooding is going to come into this area. That is a vulnerable area. With the hydrodynamic model, we'll have results of water elevations in very detail at tens of thousands of locations. We'll have detailed time-varying inundation maps based on the various climate change predictions and flood conditions and future years. We'll have flood pathways and sources. And what I really like about this, again, is the ability to test potential performance of engineering adaptations, to be able to run it again and see how it works and how that adaptation measure will perform in the future. And the next slide. So taking all this information of these 3 different studies, all of this information is going to be able to be incorporated into our GIS system, and we'll be able to use all of these potential risks and include it in our asset management plan as we're developing that. I point out again that I've got Steve Miller as a contact on here. He is the project manager. You can email either of us if you have any questions or give us a call. We'd be glad to discuss it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Our next presentation from Brad Allen of New York State DOT covers New York State DOT's risk-based transportation asset management plan. Just FYI, we've just loaded the NYSDOT draft TAMP into the TAMP builder tool at www.tamptemplate.org. This tool will soon be available also through the AASHTO Subcommittee on Asset Management website at tam.transportation.org. Brad is the director of NYSDOT's Program Management Bureau, which oversees the use of federal and state funding for the delivery of NYSDOT's $1.5 to $2 billion annual construction program. He's the project manager for developing NYSDOT's TAMP and has worked on various asset management and maintenance management projects at NYSDOT for the last 9 years. Brad developed NYSDOT's risk management practices as they relate to asset management and facilitated all of the sessions with NYSDOT staff to develop the initial risk register for the TAMP. Now I'll turn it over to Brad.
Thanks, Yana. I will say developing risk management for our asset management plan was a real team effort here at NYSDOT, and you'll see as I go through this just how many folks were involved. While developing our asset management plan, we initially had a lot of discussion about what it means for something to be risk-based, as MAP 21 requires. In the end, personally, I'm not sure any TAMP is truly risk-based versus mission-based or objective-based, performance-based. However, since all asset management plans are strategic documents, they must be forward-looking, and of course, any look forward includes uncertainty. So risk is going to be central to any asset management plan, regardless of the language we use to describe it. FHWA chose risk-based. Personally, I'd prefer language like risk-aware or risk-informed, but I think in the end it would all lead to the same document. Engaging in risk management does, as Gordon eloquently put it, helps give us foresight to adapt and evolve to our changing environment. Most of our time at DOTs is spent thinking about our immediate problems, imminent threats. Risk management, on the other hand, is all about the future and the possibilities that it holds. We often jump to the potential of threats when we talk about this subject, but I'm glad Gordon pointed out also that it includes opportunities, and that's a very big part of this. By going through the exercise of developing a risk register and referring to that register while developing our asset management policy, we're keeping ourselves focused on future outcomes. We have to operate the system today, but we're also stewards of the system and need to ensure that it will function for future users. Next slide, please. TAMPs are strategic documents, as I said. According to Merriam-Webster, strategy is, quote, a careful plan or method for achieving a particular goal, usually over a long period of time. The focus on future possibilities in risk management improves the likelihood of our future success. There is more to executing a successful program than simply issuing good policy today and waiting for good results to come out in the future. It takes years to execute a program, and changes are bound to happen along the way. By thinking about what possible change early on and laying out strategies for handling those future possibilities, we at NYSDOT feel more comfortable that in 5 years from now, we will see the benefits that are intended from our current policies and priorities. Next slide, please. Specifically in our TAMP, we addressed risk in 3 different ways. Some of these are presented directly as this is how we're addressing risk management. Some of the others are not. But each of these aspects of our TAMP involve uncertainty and how we at NYSDOT plan to manage that uncertainty. Next slide. Regarding our investment strategies, NYSDOT TAMP NYSDOT's TAMP includes three primary investment strategies. Preservation first drives a substantial portion of our total funding to maintenance-type activities focused on preserving the condition of our infrastructure that is still in good shape and preservable. This strategy prioritizes investment in low-cost treatments on higher volume roadways. This approach is risk-based in two ways. First, keeping high volume roadways in good condition serves the largest number of customers. And second, higher volume roadways cost little more to maintain than lower volume facilities, but considerably more to rehabilitate or reconstruct. So investing in them now minimizes future costs. The beyond preservation strategy addresses risk in that we recognize that in times of limited funding, investments to renew, replace, or enhance highway assets must be prioritized on a system-wide basis. And finally, the demand recovery strategy is a truly risk-based strategy. Incorporation of this recognized that the combination of our current limited funding and the first two strategies leave some low-volume rural roadways that are not maintenance candidates at a disadvantage to compete for renewal or replacement funds down the road. Demand recovery recognizes that these assets, and specifically pavements, can generally be rehabilitated for relatively low cost. So the strategy includes a limited, and I'll stress limited, amount of funding that is set aside to address these low-volume renewal pavement candidates in essentially a worst-first manner. And it closes what would otherwise be a hole in our other strategies that we identified by looking forward and seeing how those strategies would play out. This ensures that no part of our system is ignored by our investment strategies. Next slide, please. The second way we addressed risk was directly with a traditional risk register. To establish a risk register, we needed to determine what we intended to accomplish, establish a scope, define risk in relation to asset management, as this was a constrained exercise, and create a risk management process, and then finally present in the document a final product of a risk register. Next slide, please. Going into this process, we wanted to understand what were the changes we wanted to affect by adopting risk management. What did we want risk management to do for us and help us do better? While risks can come from internal or external sources, risk management, we found, at least in our early stage, seems to be inherently internally focused. What will our organization do to these perceived risks is the common question that kept coming up. What positive impacts would we like to see in our business through the adoption of risk management? And in the end, we developed these risk management objectives so that risk management would inform and influence our policy and our comprehensive program development policy, facilitate communications, align efforts, and finally meet FHWA expectations. That was really driving a lot of this. Next slide, please. To set a scope, a shared philosophy of the TAMP leadership team, TAMP development team, is to have a grand vision, but not try to realize that vision all at once. A way I commonly put this is that I feel our agency learns by doing. It is best to start basic and allow people to become comfortable with a new idea, then add in its complexity where is needed down the road. Limiting the context of risk management, this risk management exercise, to asset management, and limiting the risks we were going to address in our TAMP to agency risks allowed participants to be focused and drove discussions to what are the high-level risks that could impact our agency. Next slide, please. Most guidance on risk that we found assumes, at least in my opinion, assumes that the agency developing the risk management practices already has a mature performance management system. You find a lot of definitions that discuss the impacts of uncertainty on organizational goals. For NYSDOT, we are implementing risk management and performance management and asset management really simultaneously. So we don't have a very mature performance management framework to use to drive our risk management practices. Also, this particular effort was not scoped to include all aspects of our organization's business. It is constrained to the scope of what is in our asset management plan. To accommodate this situation, we developed the definition you see here of asset management risks. The chance of something happening that impacts NYSDOT's transportation assets or the agency's ability to manage those assets. That really helps set the scope of what will be in the risk register. Next slide, please. To develop the risk register, we used our asset management governance structure. This is not part of our org chart. These are regional and statewide teams at the technical, managerial, and executive levels that guide and set asset management policy and decisions. Each of our 4 statewide asset management teams that you see in the second row from the bottom developed draft program level risk registers and included their 5 most significant risks. Those draft registers were submitted to the comprehensive program team, which is the statewide upper management level team. And the CPT used them to establish a draft agency level risk register. And for each of the risks, 7 were identified for this agency level risk register. They included draft mitigation strategies. That was then reviewed and finalized by the Capital Program Delivery Committee, which is chaired by our commissioner, Commissioner McDonald, and they included the final mitigation strategies. It was key for executives to have executive sign off on that final register with the mitigation strategies, because those strategies require the commitment of resources. And so we wanted to make sure there was executive buy-in to committing resources to these various strategies. Next slide, please. You may have to click, thank you. In the TAMP, we present the risk register as a traditional table. And we present them as, I would say, if, then, therefore statements. And this is an idea we got from our FHWA division office, who helped us through this process. So if this event occurs, then the impact on NYSDOT or its assets will be that. Therefore, we are undertaking the following actions. And then we list who is responsible for undertaking those actions. So you see our 7 agency level risks listed here. The risk register doesn't fit well in a presentation. I encourage all of you to go to the FHWA website and take a look at our draft TAMP. And a lot of these fit with what Gordon mentioned in the beginning: climate change, funding, changes in society, information, data, software. You see a lot of those here. Next slide, please. The next thing we did was we felt it was necessary, since the TAMP is intended to guide management of assets for the next 10 years, we wanted to identify existing issues that present opportunities or challenges to us right now at time 0. The intent was not to present any of these, nor did we, as specifically an opportunity or a challenge to the department. Simply, these are issues that are more tangible than risks, but are items that the department is addressing or needs to address and impact asset management. We present these in the TAMP split between New York State challenges and opportunities and national. So for New York State, we listed New York Works Initiative, which is an interagency capital programming initiative where economic development and education and transportation plan together to come up with a comprehensive capital program for the state. This is a very new effort and something the Department of Transportation is actively engaged in. We have hydro fracking was listed as potential changes to transportation usage, economic development. We have in New York State a large portion of our NHS and federal aid system that's not owned by New York State, and we discussed New York State DOT. We discussed that. Data collection and expanding data collection to the whole federal aid system, as well as coordinating between the various federal plans that are required in MAP 21. Next slide, please. National opportunities and challenges included the elimination of bridge-specific funds and the roll-up of those and other funds into NHPP, which are only available for use on the NHS, and that is causing significant impact to our programming. As well as depletion, that's the graph there, of the federal trust fund by now. We'll see how that plays out later this month. And also the fact that we have performance measures still pending for MAP 21 as we are developing our asset management plan and asset management objectives. We still don't know what the final measures will be that will be held accountable for. Next slide. So in summary, those are the three ways that we in our TAMP addressed what I would consider aspects of risk and risk management. And I guess at the end of the webinar, I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Brad. Before we move on to our final speaker, I'd like to just remind everyone who's on the call to add questions to the Q&A interface, and we'll go through each one as they're entered at the end of Mark's next presentation. Now we'll hear from Mark Presley of Shannon & Wilson. Mark has 20 years of geotechnical experience in both the private and public sectors, including positions with the Colorado DOT as a senior geotechnical engineer and as a resident engineer. He's been involved with projects including large bridges, retaining walls, landslide stabilization, rockfall mitigation, roadway widening, and emergency road and structure failures. Mark is currently engaged in risk-based wall asset management projects for Alaska and Colorado DOT, and was the author of the 2013 Federal Highway Central Federal Land Publication on Implementation Concepts and Strategies for Geotechnical Asset Management. And now let's give our attention to Mark.
Thank you. Yeah, so today I'm going to talk about work that's been done for several programs within CDOT that also incorporates some of the similar work supporting plan development for Alaska, state DOT, and federal lands. And much of this presentation is going to be focused on assets that are not historically managed by US DOTs, but do present at times a high risk to performance. So Kevin mentioned, Brad previously mentioned the challenge of defining risk, and then Gordon referenced ISO 31000. If we go to that resource and other resources out there as far as what is risk, you know, the traditional definition is likelihood times consequence. But within the context of TAM, some of the takeaway is that risk can be evaluated at different levels and using available data. It doesn't have to be a highly complex quantitative type of approach. In a lot of cases, we have existing condition or other asset data that really can be surrogates for either of those inputs into the risk calculation. And next slide, what's important is that the consequences can be related to the TAM performance. And so when we think about these consequences, and the bolded text here just highlights some of the tie to the MAP 21 or ASTO performance areas. And these can be the areas that we can build these risk analyses around. So whether it's specific damage to the asset or other measures or performance areas such as safety and environment, reliability, externalities, things like that. All these are aspects that we can incorporate into these risk-based plans. Next slide. So just to review, there's 3 different projects here that we'll talk about that have been done for CDOT. Next. The first of these is the Rockfall Management Plan, which was recently updated, and the takeaway from this one is that we were able to use a significant amount of data on 760 sites that have been tracked and measured for over 20 years, and really we were able to just transition that data from more of a hazard assessment into a risk assessment. And this slide just illustrates, we have several of these high hazard rock sites. We know their conditions, but depending on the traffic, that is an influence into whether or not this might be classified as a low risk or a high risk. Next slide. So from that analysis, we were able to, and this is just a statewide view of the Rockfall asset plan, and it just illustrates the areas where these high-risk sites were identified, and the performance plan was put together to work to mitigate these sites and reduce the high risk that it presents to, say, safety and mobility measures. Next slide. The next project involved the underserved asset screening that CDOT did in support of their risk-based asset management plan last year. As part of the development of the risk register, a couple different workshops and meetings were held to identify a list of 78 underserved assets. And again, these were pretty much the non-pavement and non-bridge assets that are typically managed. So, the list there: environmental, non-bridge structures such as signs or culverts of smaller sizes, wildlife fencing, the geologic hazards, property, all these different classes that present performance risk to those various performance areas we're interested in. Next slide. As part of this, the tool was created within CDOT. This was an in-house tool that was able to evaluate all these assets together using the same consequence and likelihood measures, and so that we could essentially evaluate different assets against each other at a relatively high level, kind of at a system or program level. And that next slide was used in a final workshop where a risk register was created, and that risk register also considered an event typically tied to those assets. We used experts within the department in a half-day workshop to go through and have consensus on the likelihood and the consequence scores, and ultimately that was used to build this risk register and identify those assets at the different levels, whether it's project, program, or the agency risk, and what their risk level was. Next slide, please. Moving on with some of the other risk-based implementation. Currently, the geotechnical hazards management plan is being developed, and here again we're focused on risk and the consequences that these geotechnical hazards or assets present to the department performance aspects. These were hazards that, such as landslides and rockfall and debris flows, subgrade failures, those type of features that have historically caused significant internal costs and mobility impacts. With the expert panel that was done for the risk-based asset management plan, those features were identified as generally presenting a high risk, and these can be managed within the context of a TAM plan, as many of these are assets within the right-of-way. But again, we're focused on evaluating these against performance measures related to, say, safety and mobility or maintenance. Next slide, please. This map just outlines, the distribution. There's roughly 1,300 sites around the state of various natures. About half of them are rockfall related. That's just a big hazard within Colorado. But there's a lot of other features here, and some of these features have been responsible for multi-day closures and several million-dollar repairs to various highways around the state. Next. This slide just is that same, let me go back one. This slide is just a representation of those sites now, and a similar figure was created for safety risk and for maintenance risk. This just shows the mobility risk figure, but it identifies what is the location of these various high-risk sites, medium risk, low risk, and what's important is that we had to work with experts within the department, maintenance, and program staff to identify or to define what is a high risk, and so that we could categorize these correctly. Next slide. This is just a different representation of this, and this is the similar data, only it's now being contoured into a risk density plot. And this is a means to better identify areas of treatment potential when we want to have a performance or an objective to obtain the highest level of risk reduction that can be obtained within the budget constraints. This also helps with identifying what we might call corridors. So we're essentially aggregating multiple sites or multiple risks to better evaluate how we can, at a system level, better attain risk reduction. And so those red areas would tend to be, and the other contoured areas as well, but this allows us to contour that density for just a better management plan. Next slide. The last work here involves the wall asset management plan that CDOT's doing. This is for both retaining walls and sound walls. This work was begun at the end of last year and is ongoing right now. Initially, for this work, part of the goal was just determining what even existed in that inventory. So a rapid risk-based inventory was performed using online tools such as Google Earth and the CDOT GIS system with the photo viewers. That allowed a lot of this work to be done in December and January, when traditionally you might not have been able to get out and view these sites due to weather. So it was a little more cost effective than driving folks around the state. Just in that higher level analysis, there's been over 1,600 walls identified, and it continues to grow. Within that analysis, when we look at just the consequence and the likelihood of an adverse event with a wall, there's currently 50 walls identified. Because of the number of assets here and the early stage in this, a multi-tiered analysis was performed. So a first tier that is focused on all walls, and then a second tier which focuses more on the medium and high risk. And this work was also done to collect the data in a consistent format with NBI and typical bridge inspection. So again, using measures and inputs that are commonly already obtained. Next slide. This slide here just shows the workflow that's evolved, and maybe it's difficult to read, but the green circles, those focus on areas where we're doing risk analysis within the workflow. The triangles are different levels of inspection, and then the hexagons there are more the areas where the analysis is leading to recommended action. So as we go through this workflow, we're evaluating these walls for low and medium condition risk, and then those walls with the higher risk levels get an additional inspection level so that we're not doing that rigorous level of inspection on all walls. It allows us to put together a more cost-effective plan. Next slide. This slide just shows the distribution of those walls, and again, we're ranking these walls on the basis of a low, medium, high risk, with a high risk being a wall that might have a high likelihood of impacting a travel lane and causing a mobility impact or having a significant impact to maintenance resources. Next slide. Using these data and then looking backwards in time, we are attempting to calibrate the growth in the CDOT wall asset inventory, and then use that to do some pro forma modeling at this stage to see how that class of assets may grow. And then within that, we know we have 51 high-risk walls now, and based on the age of the walls and that analysis, we're able to establish maybe what the trend in that those high-risk walls and their quantity growth with time. Next slide. So those data were then used in some additional pro forma modeling to create support for the funding proposal that CDOT would use to identify the benefit of this risk reduction. So the red line would be kind of a passive management plan, roughly what they spend now dealing with unplanned fixes and whatnot, and tied to that growth in the asset class. If we develop a performance measure that is based on reducing the number of high-risk walls and maybe maintaining medium-risk walls from going into that high-risk category, we get the blue line. So we have to get through an initial surge of risk reduction, and then there's kind of a maintenance value that would go along with trying to maintain these walls out of the high-risk level. So next slide. So some of these implementation lessons are here. I think we've heard Kevin mention data a few times. I think he also might have mentioned the value of maintenance forces. Data may not be perfect, but we need to start somewhere. The risk analysis can account for the reliability or poor reliability in that data, but we just start, and the plan is going to evolve. Gordon mentioned these are living documents. So we start the data collection, and it's going to get better as time goes on. As we put together the geotechnical and the wall management plans, we've had a lot of discussions on levels of service, and I think for right now, the goal is more to just focus on performance targets, as it's difficult to maybe define levels of service for assets that traditionally haven't had that, and to identify those levels of service at the start. Again, a multi-tier approach is being done on both these geotechnical and wall assets. It's valuable when you might have low-risk assets that maybe they don't deserve the same degree of analysis and monitoring as others. Again, pro forma modeling is being relied on here at the beginning, just because it's we're just trying to establish what assets might even exist, so the opportunities for deterioration models or things like that aren't quite there yet. And then finally, just there's a benefit of corridor management, areas where we have high risk, and that's where we're focused on right now. So with that does it for my presentation.
Thank you, Mark. So that concludes our presentations for today. Thank you to all of our presenters. This is very valuable information right now. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A feature of the webinar toolbar. I'll take them in the order as you type them. So we have a question from Ben Orsman, and I'm just going to read it. I was particularly intrigued by the various definitions and examples of risk, many that were very insightful. Might we be able to obtain a list or a catalog with short definitions for states to use to check against their asset management plans? Steve and Gordon, could you discuss if such a list currently exists already, or is this something that could be produced quickly, possibly from today's webinars? If it's a short list, we can easily add it to the guidance that's included in the TAMP Builder tool, which could have a checklist as part of the guidance. Steve. Steve, I think you're still muted. Gordon, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, Hiana. The 5-part series that Steve mentioned does have a literature review with it. And the first part of that literature review, which is on the Federal Highway Asset Management Publications website, has a long list of various risk definitions just to illustrate the various ways in which risk is applied. I would caution that none of those are official federal highway definitions, and that, you know, they're there for illustrative purposes to describe how different industries handle risk. We could, though, with Steve's permission, boil that down into a set of definitions, and both in Brad's asset management plan and in Colorado's, they have some very good stratification of risks, such as information risk and policy risk and financial risks. And we could take those, and even if they weren't official definitions, we could provide enough description to allow someone to understand sort of the taxonomy of risks and how to categorize them. So we could do that if that's something people would like to have.
Thanks, Gordon. Steve, are you able to have audio?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
No, this will not be specifically addressed in a notice of proposed rulemaking, but I believe, like what Gordon said, it's addressed in the guide series, and I believe the resource from these webinars also will be quite beneficial. But yes, we can go ahead and put further information together, like Gordon said.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, the next question is from Katie Zimmerman. Could the speakers discuss whether the risk analysis was used to drive investments, or was it primarily used to tell the story or justify planned uses of available resources? In other words, did the analysis of risk result in changes in the way investments were made? Shall we start with Kevin?
Sure. I'd say from our standpoint on all these studies that we worked on and projects, it's to assess what we have and make sure that there's no additional money associated with it, but make sure that as we plan projects, we make the right decisions and in wherever possible incorporate changes to improve resiliency. So I think that gets to the issue.
Thanks, Kevin. Brad?
Yeah, I would say yes, and also it will. As I went over in our broad investment strategies, those were very much risk-driven, based on looking at their strategies that were developed with our funding levels in mind. So we looked at what we can afford and what's the best way to get the outcomes that we need, and we established those strategies. So that was inherently a risk-based process. As far as our more formal risk register, those mitigation strategies are really just getting underway. So things like collecting data on the entire federal aid system beyond the NHS that we don't own will eventually provide data that will directly drive how our investments are made, because we'll be using a data-driven process for all assets on the federal aid system, where now we have our NYSDOT data, but local owners may have no data or different data in most cases. So in the end, strategies like, or mitigation strategies like that will eventually change how we invest our funds. So it's a combination of yes, it has, and yes, I expect it to in the future.
Mark?
Sure, yeah. On the CDOT case, from my understanding, yes. On the rockfall, that guided the investment strategy starting last year, and the geotechnical and the walls. They're currently, I think even as of this week, going through that investment process using a Delphi process to establish the investments going forward for the next few fiscal years. And I think they'll be doing that again in August.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, this should be for a second. This is Steve. I think going back to one of the slides that Gordon showed, where it was triangular in nature, where it had the agency's goals, objectives, and it showed asset management, performance management, and risk management. I think a key is if some items look like they are high risk and affect the performance of the network, sometimes you're going to have to address that issue rather than a short-term performance goal, etc. So if you're looking at the goals of asset management being management for the whole life and the risk to the network, some of these items may jump out at you as you're looking at your network more comprehensively. You know, I don't think there's a perfect mathematical equation on when you do A, B, or C, but with that transparent way of making decisions and all that information in front of you, it's going to certainly affect how programming takes place.
Kiana, this is Brad. If I could take a second bite at this apple, I'd like to take a couple seconds just to step back with this question, because this same question came up when we discussed our TAMPs in general, and the question was, has your TAMP changed the way that you invest? And I think you need to say, as an agency entering into developing an asset management plan, and specifically with the risk management portion of that, you have to have that as an intention, that we are undertaking this effort in order to improve the way that we make investment decisions for our infrastructure and improve how we commit our resources to achieving our agency's goals as an organization. And you need to monitor yourself through self-assessment at the long term, but also at a project level short term as you go through this, to make sure that what you're doing in developing your TAMP and the way you're going about developing your risk management practices is actually doing that. Because you could get into a lot of wasted effort to produce a very pretty 100-and-something page report and a long list of risks that in the end signify nothing. So I think it's very important to recognize that that's the whole purpose for doing this, is to improve the way we make investment decisions as transportation agencies.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
So, yes? Was there another comment? Okay, so a final comment from Ben Orsman, and his point is just related to all of the recent responses from the panelists. The risk registers help some with those definitions of risk, but the risk reduction associated with having adequate funding to address risk at the time of least cost is a concept that needs to be heavily promoted. Okay, with that, we will move on to the final slide. Oh, we have to go back. But basically, our next webinar on the schedule is on managing off-system assets. It will be held August 13th at 2 p.m.